Welcome to Sleep with Secrets, where bedtime gets darker and secrets never sleep. If you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and subscribe, because some stories disappear before they're ever heard again. And tell me, where in the world are you listening from tonight? I'd like to know where the secrets are spreading. Now get comfortable and let's get started. Story 1. This takes us deep into the quiet unraveling of a man who once loved too deeply and lost everything. In the stillness of a troubled home, emotions simmered until one winter night, silence shattered everything. Joseph Paul DeWise hadn't always been this way. There was a time when life felt normal, routine even. A house, a wife, children, and days that blended into evenings filled with family dinners and bedtime stories. But what no one saw, what even Joseph himself could not fully grasp, was how quickly love could rot into obsession, and how obsession, left unchecked, could pull a man into something far darker. Paul's love for Lauren had once been pure. He adored her, perhaps too much. Over the years, Lauren, his wife, and the mother of their children began to grow distant, quiet, disconnected. The sparkle that had once filled their shared moments dimmed, and with each passing day, Paul could feel her slipping away. It started small. Lauren began to avoid his gaze or during arguments. Her replies shortened. Her laughter faded. She became more protective of her phone. And then, one night, she packed a bag. "I'll only be back for the kids," she said. Those words hollowed Paul out. Her absence was immediate, but her silence afterward was even louder. He began writing letters, pouring out his shame, his guilt, his desperate apologies, trying to preserve a love that was already gone. "I have no excuse for what happened," he wrote in one of his earliest letters, dated July 24th, 2017. "I'm a bad person. I ruined everything. You deserve someone better than me." The words dripped with guilt, but even then, there was something unsettling in them, something not just remorseful, but self-imploding. He didn't just feel bad, he hated himself. And when that hatred wasn't enough, it turned outward. Paul had grown up with chaos. His father's hands had once wrapped around his mother's throat, purple-faced and gasping. That memory, long buried, began to echo in his mind whenever he thought of his own outbursts in front of his kids. He didn't just fear becoming his father, he believed he already had. Instead of healing, Paul spiraled. He began manipulating his children, softly seeding ideas that painted him as the victim. He recorded them speaking about Lauren, hoping their voices would sway her, prove his point, or bring her back. But each attempt seemed only to push Lauren further away. Her silence was unbearable. It brewed storms inside him. He sent messages, relentless, emotional, unfiltered. They would begin soft, almost poetic, praising her as a mother and begging her to come home. But as the hours passed and no reply came, those words would twist into rage. "I am a piece of crap now," he texted. "My life is ruined. My wife doesn't care. You're abusive." He lashed out at those around her too. Friends, coworkers, anyone he thought might be taking Lauren from him. He accused them of corrupting her, of encouraging her to act like she was single. He told one woman, "You are not a good influence. My wife needs family-oriented friends." The messages came day after day, growing more aggressive, more frantic. And Lauren, she stayed silent. It shattered him. He began to watch her. There's a kind of loneliness that doesn't come from being alone, but from loving someone who no longer loves you back. That's the kind of silence Joseph Paul could no longer live with. By the fall of 2017, Paul wasn't just grieving the loss of his marriage, he was unraveling. Each day without Lauren sharpened his paranoia. He became convinced that she was seeing other men. It wasn't just a suspicion, it was a belief, cemented by loneliness and fueled by obsession. His texts turned darker. The desperation grew thicker in his words. "How can you make me deal with this by myself?" he wrote. "I want you to save us. I'm sick again. At this point, Paul wasn't seeking resolution. He was seeking control, something to ground him, something to convince himself that Lauren wasn't slipping further away. But every unanswered message only widened the chasm between them. So he watched her. He began to track her movements. He learned where she went, the bars she visited, the people she spoke to. He even signed up for a GPS tracking service and registered her phone to it, without her consent. It was no longer just emotional collapse, it was surveillance. It was obsession in motion. On November 14th, 2017, Paul followed Lauren. That night, what he saw would ignite something inside him that couldn't be undone. She was parked in a car with a coworker, Kevin. Through the windshield, Paul watched as they kissed. The moment shattered whatever self-restraint he had left. He approached the car in a rage, fumbling with his phone to record. But what he captured was barely more than a blur. Seconds of chaos. Kevin stepped out. Lauren panicked. Paul screamed. He later took her phone and began texting Kevin himself. Messages filled with fury and humiliation. The next night, he found Lauren again, this time with a different coworker, Brian. Though Brian had no romantic connection with Lauren, that didn't matter to Paul. His jealousy didn't require proof, only presence. He approached the car again, but this time Brian retaliated. A punch to the face, a warning, and Paul, bloodied and humiliated, went home. Not to reflect, but to retaliate. He posted publicly on Facebook, "Anyone in Bozeman who cares. My wife was making out with her manager last night outside an apartment. She is the best liar I have ever known." The post wasn't for Lauren. It was for the world, to expose her, shame her, paint her as the villain in a story that had long ceased to be about truth. Then came the videos. Paul began recording himself. He poured his thoughts into the camera, into his journal, into the void where Lauren's replies used to be. Each video was a window into his unraveling mind, angry, broken, filled with contradictions. "I'm angry," he muttered in one recording, "and it's hard for me to live with." He wasn't just losing Lauren, he was losing his grip on reality. And yet, Paul kept reaching out, message after message. Videos laced with apologies followed by bitterness. At one point, he even approached one of Lauren's female friends in a bar and threatened her, saying, "I've killed people before. I'm not afraid to do it again." Those weren't just drunken threats. They were warning signs. A storm was coming. And no one, not Lauren, not her friends, not even Paul, knew just how close it was. Because when love turns into hatred, what's left behind is a kind of silence that doesn't heal. It destroys. Sometimes, the most dangerous person is the one who feels like they have nothing left to lose and everything has already been taken. By December, Paul was no longer hiding his rage behind regret. The months of emotional turmoil, jealousy, and self-pity had carved deep scars into his mind. What began as sadness had grown roots into bitterness, obsession, and now violence. His world no longer felt real. It felt scripted, like everyone else was playing a role in a play he was no longer a part of. Then came the final crack. It had nothing to do with Lauren. One day, while walking down the street with his daughter, a neighbor's dogs began barking behind a fence. What should have been a brief moment of annoyance became something else entirely. Paul exploded with anger. When the homeowner came outside to see what was happening, Paul lost control. He pulled a pocket knife. In a matter of seconds, he stabbed the man in the hip, right there, in daylight, with his daughter at his side, and he recorded it. His voice shook as he spoke to the camera afterward. "I defended myself," he said. "I had to protect my baby." But in the footage, there was no real threat, no real danger, only Paul, panicked, angry, narrating the world through a lens that had long since blurred. Legally, he got away with it. The man had technically made first contact, and Paul claimed self-defense. No charges were filed. But something shifted that day. Paul had crossed the line, and he'd survived it. Now, violence wasn't just a thought. It was an option, a real one. Weeks passed, New Year's came and went, and then came January 6th. That morning, Paul sent Lauren a text. "Soup's ready. Come over." There was no reply. He texted again later that day. "Are we still meeting tomorrow?" Lauren replied hours later. "What for?" "I want to pick up my dog. I'd like to spend time with her." The message was short, cold, detached. It was exactly what Paul feared most, that he no longer held any emotional weight in her life, that she didn't love him, that she didn't need him. And he snapped. He went silent for several hours, but he wasn't still. At 12:34 a.m., security footage captured Paul at a gas station, filling up, alone. Shortly after, he took a blurry photo with his phone. The image showed Lauren's home in the distance, and a GPS tracking device in the corner of the frame. He had been following her car, watching. At 3:56 a.m., he sent her one last message. "I know I'm not supposed to text you now, but I can't sleep. Please, please come home. I love you so much. We all do. Please just come home." She never replied, and by morning, the silence would turn deadly. Some mornings arrive with a chill that doesn't come from the weather, but from something much darker, still lingering in the air, unseen, but unmistakable. It was January 7th, 2018, a quiet Sunday morning in Belgrade, Montana. The streets were still. The sun hadn't yet cast its light on what had taken place just hours earlier. Inside a small house on Idaho Street, something terrible had happened. Lauren DeWise lay motionless on the bedroom floor. Her roommate, Ashley, was crumpled nearby, barely breathing, bleeding from multiple gunshot wounds. The silence in the house was unnatural, broken only by the faint hum of appliances and Ashley's shallow, fading breath. It wasn't long before the neighbors heard something, a sudden crack, a sound that didn't belong in a sleepy neighborhood. Someone knocked on the door. When there was no answer, they stepped inside, and then chaos. Emergency services were called immediately. "Someone shot a roommate," the caller said. "There's blood, a lot of blood." The dispatcher tried to stay calm, but urgency threaded through every word. Officers arrived within minutes. They moved carefully through the house, guns drawn. The front door was slightly ajar. Nothing was disturbed. No signs of forced entry, no broken windows. But the trail of horror inside was undeniable. 2 women, one dead, one barely alive, and one name spoken by the neighbor, Paul. Joseph Paul DeWise. They had seen the signs, the stalking, the threats, the anger that simmered in his voice each time he spoke about Lauren. No one wanted to believe he'd go this far, but now they had to. The officers made their way upstairs. Ashley was still conscious, barely. Blood soaked her shirt. A bullet had torn through the back of her head, another through her shoulder, and others they couldn't immediately locate. She was dazed, confused. She didn't even know she'd been shot. One officer knelt beside her. "It's okay," he whispered. "We're here. We're going to help you." She couldn't respond. Her lips trembled. Her eyes darted around the room, searching for something, anything that made sense. The officer stayed with her, holding her hand, keeping her awake. And in the next room, Lauren. She was already gone. No words could undo what had been done. The scene was quiet now, but the violence had left its mark on the walls, on the floor, on the faces of every officer who stepped into that room. Paul was gone. Nowhere to be found, but not without a trace. Outside the house, officers found footprints in the snow, trailing from the east side of the property to the back. A thin trail of blood dotted the prints. At the time, it didn't seem like much, just a lead, a clue. But later, it would tell the full story. Sometimes survival isn't a triumph, it's a burden. Waking up doesn't mean the nightmare has ended. It means you're the only one left to remember it. Ashley's eyes fluttered open in the hospital room. She couldn't speak at first. Her body felt foreign, heavy and slow, as though it belonged to someone else. The pain was there, but it lingered beneath layers of shock. The last thing she remembered clearly was going to bed the night before. Everything after that was a blur, a broken film reel skipping frames. Lauren was gone. Ashley didn't know that yet. Doctors had worked around the clock to keep her alive. Emergency surgeries, blood transfusions, a ventilator. She had been shot multiple times, including once in the head. Her survival wasn't just rare, it was a miracle. But the trauma had scrambled her memory, leaving only fragments. Detectives waited patiently outside her room. They knew if Ashley could talk, if she could recall anything at all, it might be the key to solving everything. When the time came, they spoke gently. They asked simple questions. Her name, the date, if she remembered anything from the night before. Ashley shook her head. "I don't remember being shot," she said faintly. "I didn't even know I had been." She was confused, disoriented, but her will to survive was stronger than the bullets that had torn through her. And though her answers were few, her presence was enough to ignite hope. Because now, they had a witness. But even more pressing, Paul was still missing, and the clock was ticking. Detectives began retracing every step of the day before. They studied Paul's texts. They pulled surveillance footage from the gas station. They matched timestamps with GPS data and examined the blurry photo Paul had taken of Lauren's home. Everything pointed to premeditation. This wasn't a crime of passion, it was planned. He had lured Lauren, he had watched her, he had followed her home, and he had waited for the right moment to strike. The question now was, where did he go? Search teams canvassed the area. They moved through alleys, woods, and sheds. They knocked on doors. They swept Lauren's house again, inch by inch. And then, in the snow near the back fence, they found it. A blood trail. It wound through the yard, over a patch of dead grass, and stopped near a wooden gate. It wasn't just footsteps, it was escape, and Paul had left it behind. But even with the trail, he was gone, vanished, as if the night had swallowed him whole. Blood doesn't lie. It leaves whispers behind, fragments of truth when everything else has been wiped away. In the cold light of day, the snow betrayed him. What Joseph Paul didn't account for, what he couldn't erase, was the blood he left behind. Faint at first, but undeniable. A trail that led investigators from the back of Lauren's home to the edge of the neighborhood. No forced entry, no signs of a struggle, just silence and steps stained with guilt. He had come with purpose. He had left with blood on his shoes. And now, he was nowhere. As detectives gathered evidence, the pieces slowly began to connect. Surveillance video from that gas station showed him alone, calm, focused, filling his tank at 12:34 a.m., not long before the murder. His phone location aligned with the crime scene. The final blurry photo of Lauren's house, taken from a distance, placed him right where he needed to be. But what haunted the team most were the texts. The final messages he sent to Lauren hours before she died. Please come home. I love you so much. We all do. That was the last time her phone lit up with his name. By the time neighbors found Lauren's body, Paul had vanished into the dark. But investigators weren't giving up. They spoke with Adria, the neighbor who had made the frantic 911 call. She hadn't hesitated to name Paul because she had seen the signs all along. She told them about the screaming matches, the fear in Lauren's voice, the late night messages Paul had sent, begging, accusing, unraveling. She'd seen Lauren change over the past year, grow more guarded, more withdrawn. She told detectives that Lauren had once confided in her. "He's not well," Lauren had said. "I think I need to leave for good." That moment was real, and Adria never forgot it. The more investigators listened to Adria, the clearer the picture became. Paul hadn't just lost his wife, he had slowly lost his grasp on reality. His behavior was escalating. His desperation had turned into rage, and Lauren had finally stopped responding. But there was still a question no one could answer. Where was Paul now? The manhunt expanded. Officers searched motels, rest stops, cabins in nearby towns. They checked train stations, airports. His phone had been turned off. No digital trail, no sightings. It was as if, after leaving that yard, Joseph Paul had simply disappeared into the air. But the blood told a different story. He was wounded, maybe not severely, but enough. He wasn't running clean. He was running scared, and time was running out. People don't just disappear, but when they do, they leave behind more than footprints. They leave behind questions, and a chilling sense that they're not as far as they seem. By the second day, the air in Belgrade felt different, colder, still, like the town itself was holding its breath, waiting for something, anything to break the silence. Joseph Paul was still gone. To the people who had known him, this disappearance was terrifying, not because he'd vanished, but because of what he might do next. Paul wasn't just a man on the run, he was a man unraveling, and now he had nothing left. Detectives pored over everything, his texts, his voice recordings, his Facebook rants. Dozens of videos and audio clips captured in the months leading up to Lauren's death. Each one offered a disturbing glimpse into a deteriorating mind. "I'm angry," he said in one video, tears in his voice. "My kids are angry, and it's hard for me to live with that." But anger was only part of it. The real threat, the part that made him dangerous, was how he had stopped seeing Lauren as a person. She had become a symbol of betrayal, of rejection, of everything he thought he had lost control over. And now, with blood on his hands and no one to stop him, Paul was a ghost in the wind. The search continued. State police joined the hunt. Helicopters combed through remote areas. Bloodhounds picked up the scent from the crime scene and traced it to a frozen stretch of land leading toward the woods. But again, nothing. No sightings, no abandoned vehicle, no body, just snow and silence. Still, investigators refused to slow down. They combed through every inch of his digital footprint. They questioned his family, his friends, his co-workers. Everyone had the same question: where would Paul go if he believed his life was already over? Some believed he'd taken his own life, that after killing Lauren and injuring Ashley, he'd found a secluded place and ended everything. But if that were true, where was the body? Others weren't so sure. They believed he was still alive, hiding, watching, that Paul had enough survival instinct and just enough detachment from reality to disappear for real. Either way, the fear lingered, and in the town of Belgrade, doors stayed locked a little longer at night. When someone disappears, it's not just their presence that's missing, it's their shadow, their voice, their memories, left behind like fingerprints on everything they ever touched. Paul's house stood empty now, still furnished, still full of signs of life, but lifeless all the same. The air inside felt heavy, like it hadn't been moved in days. A faint scent of stale beer lingered in the living room. Family photos still hung on the walls, moments frozen in time long before the rage had taken over. Detectives searched the home with care. They weren't just looking for evidence, they were looking for answers. In the bedroom drawer, they found more letters, dozens of them, all addressed to Lauren. Some were handwritten, others typed. Some were desperate apologies, others were unfiltered rage. "I ruined us, I know that, but I won't let you pretend I didn't fight for us. You lied to me, to our kids. You broke this family, not me. Please come home. I'm still the man who loves you." The letters were heartbreaking, but more than that, they were dangerous. They revealed a man who couldn't let go, a man who needed control more than he needed peace. In a locked cabinet, they found journals, pages and pages of scattered thoughts, paranoia, self-hate, long rants about Lauren's supposed betrayals. obsessions about her new friends, co-workers, men she'd never even been romantically involved with. His words bled confusion and bitterness. She smiles for everyone but me. I see her chasing money, vanity, Bozeman boys with clean shirts and big wallets. She doesn't want family. She wants to be adored. Reading his thoughts felt like staring into a cracked mirror, distorted, broken, yet painfully clear. This wasn't just a man in pain. It was a man drowning in it. In the basement, investigators found old camcorder tapes. Some dated back years. Most were of Paul talking to himself. Some featured the children playing. Others were unsettling. Paul pacing, recording himself in mid-rant, drunk and weeping. "You don't even love your job," he shouted in one. "You just want to be around people who don't know the real you." He'd been documenting everything. His descent, his pain, his final steps before it all fell apart. One video stood out. In it, Paul stared into the lens, eyes bloodshot, unshaven, slurring slightly. "This is what happens when people stop caring," he said. "You want to know what pushed me? It wasn't hate, it was silence." That line stayed with the investigators long after they shut off the tape. Because deep down, they knew. Joseph Paul DeWise didn't vanish because he had a plan. He vanished because, in his mind, the world had already let go of him, and he was just returning the favor. Some people leave the dead behind, but the survivors carry the story, and sometimes that story is the only thing that brings the truth into the light. Ashley's recovery was slow. Her body healed first, fractured bones reset, bullet wounds stitched, blood replenished. But her memory, that was more complicated. Trauma doesn't just erase moments. It scrambles them, hides them, makes them feel like dreams or hallucinations. For days, Ashley drifted in and out of awareness, trying to understand how she'd gone to sleep one night and woken up in a hospital bed, half the town whispering her name. The detective visited again, gently, patiently. He didn't ask what happened, not at first. He just asked how she was feeling, if she could remember anything at all. The goal wasn't to pressure her. It was to help her piece it together, one fragment at a time. One morning, she asked a question. "Did Lauren die?" The room fell quiet. The detective nodded once. Ashley turned her face to the wall. The tears came slowly, silent and stunned. She hadn't known for sure, but now she did. That truth changed everything. In the following days, more memories returned, not clearly, not like watching a movie, but flashes. The sound of the front door, a voice, footsteps on the stairs, Lauren's voice. Then a sudden pop, louder than thunder, and then nothing. Ashley remembered the way Lauren's body slumped near her, the heat, the sting, the confusion. "I didn't know I was shot," she told the detective. "I thought I'd fallen. I thought I was dreaming." But one thing she never forgot was Paul. Not just his face, but the feeling of him in the house. The way the air shifted when he was nearby, the fear that came with his presence, even before anything violent happened. She remembered Lauren crying in the days before, talking about the constant texts, the watching, the threats. She remembered Lauren whispering, "If anything ever happens to me, it's him." That was all the detectives needed to hear. Ashley's words were soft, shaky, but they were enough. She didn't need to say much because Lauren had already told the truth before it was too late. Paul had stalked her. Paul had watched her. Paul had pulled the trigger. And Ashley, by some quiet miracle, had lived to tell the story. After violence, there's always a hush, not of peace, but of people waiting for justice, for answers, for the world to feel safe again. Belgrade wasn't a big town. It was the kind of place where people knew each other by name, where neighbors waved, where families gathered for school plays and Sunday services. Violence felt like something that happened elsewhere, on the news, not next door. So when Lauren was killed and Paul disappeared, the entire town changed. Fear crept into grocery stores and classrooms. Parents gripped their children tighter. Strangers looked over their shoulders. Even the trees seemed quieter, because everyone knew he hadn't been caught. Everyone knew Joseph Paul DeWise was still out there. For law enforcement, it became more than a manhunt. It became a mission to restore safety. Every morning brought new leads, calls from nearby towns, tips from distant relatives, sightings that led nowhere. Still, they searched. They brought in dogs again, reviewed satellite imagery, watched his bank accounts. But Paul had left no digital trail. His phone had gone dark. His credit cards hadn't been touched. He had either vanished or planned his escape long before pulling the trigger. But those who knew him didn't believe he planned anything. They believed he broke. That after months of building pressure, after a lifetime of hurt and loss and unresolved wounds, something inside him simply snapped. And once he stepped over that line, once the silence between him and Lauren became permanent, he didn't know how to come back. Back at Lauren's house, the crime scene had been cleaned, the police tape removed. The front lawn looked just like any other on the street. But those who walked by felt it, the weight, the sadness, the knowing. Neighbors left flowers at the porch. A candle flickered each night in the window. For weeks, the house stood like a monument to what had happened, until Lauren's family made arrangements to have it cleared and locked. Inside, a single photo frame remained on the wall. It was of Lauren and her kids, smiling in better times. The frame was cracked, the glass still holding, just barely, like the town itself. Even after the crime scene tape comes down, the echoes stay. In the stillness of hallways, in the spaces people once stood, in the words left unsaid. Ashley had left the hospital by then. She moved quietly, with care. Her body still stiff with healing. Her face was pale, her steps deliberate, but she was alive. And for everyone involved, that meant something. It meant not all the light had gone out that night. She stayed with family, somewhere private, away from cameras, away from reporters. But even in her silence, her survival was its own kind of voice. She never went back to that house, and she never had to. Detectives continued to build their case, not because they didn't know who had done it, but because the system needed proof. It needed a case file that would stand in court. If Paul was found, there would be a trial. And Lauren's story deserved to be told, start to finish, in a room that demanded justice. They collected everything. Her phone, his journals, the surveillance footage, the messages, the videos, the blood trail. Ashley's statement, Adria's testimony, even Paul's own words, from his long recordings of breakdowns and confessions. One of the last videos Paul made, never meant to be seen, was found on an old SD card tucked beneath his bed. In it, Paul sat alone, barely lit by a lamp. His eyes were distant, sunken. He didn't cry. He didn't rage. He just talked. "I didn't plan this," he said. "I just couldn't stop hurting. Every day I'd wake up hoping she'd come back. Every night I'd fall asleep hating myself for hoping." He paused. Then, "If this ends bad, tell the kids I love them, that I tried to be something better. I just wasn't strong enough." It wasn't an excuse. It wasn't an apology. It was a man sinking into his own silence, deeper than anyone could reach. The video ended without a goodbye. And for the detectives, that made it harder. Because even with all the evidence, they still hadn't found him. Still hadn't closed the circle. Paul had become a ghost, his face still pinned on wanted posters, his name still whispered in town. And until he was found, no one could sleep fully in peace. Grief has a strange rhythm. It doesn't move in straight lines. It lingers. In empty chairs, in unopened messages, in the way a room feels too quiet at the end of the day. Lauren's family tried to carry on. They gathered in her sister's living room in the days after the funeral. Her parents sat quietly, holding hands. Her children played nearby, too young to fully understand what had happened, but old enough to feel something had changed. Something had been taken. There were photos of Lauren everywhere, smiling at a wedding, blowing out candles on a birthday, holding her youngest child at the hospital. Each image captured a woman who had once been full of life. bright, grounded, deeply loved. Now those photos were all that remained. Her sister Megan became the quiet voice that held the family together. She coordinated everything: the funeral arrangements, the counseling for the kids, the legal steps to transfer guardianship. She never broke down in public. She saved her tears for the shower or the quiet moments after everyone else had fallen asleep. One evening, she lit a candle by the kitchen window and whispered, "I hope you weren't scared," because that's what haunted her the most. Not just that Lauren was gone, but how. The fear she must have felt, the helplessness in those final seconds. Paul had stolen more than a life. He had stolen peace, and that absence lingered. In every phone call Lauren would never answer, in every school event she'd miss, in every future moment she should have been a part of. Her children began to ask questions, simple ones at first. "Where's Mommy? Can I see her today? Did she go to heaven?" The family answered gently, honestly. They told them Mommy had gotten hurt, that she was gone, that she loved them very much. One child asked, "Did Daddy hurt her?" No one answered right away. Eventually Megan spoke. "Daddy made a very bad mistake, and now he can't be here either." There was no anger in her voice, just sorrow, because explaining murder to a child is like trying to explain the wind. You can't see it, you just feel it, and it knocks everything over. There's a strange ache that comes with the unknown, not grief, but something quieter, a longing for closure, a need to turn the last page when the final chapter is still missing. Months passed, the snow melted, the town moved forward, but not on. Paul was still missing, and his absence hung in the air like fog that never lifted. People whispered when they walked past his old house. Some said they saw him at a diner 2 towns over, at a gas station on the highway, but none of those sightings were ever confirmed. He had vanished, and yet his story refused to end. Detectives followed every trail. They chased credit card transactions that led nowhere, an abandoned jacket in a ditch, a blurry figure caught on a security camera in Wyoming, a tip from a hiker who said he saw a man matching Paul's description sleeping in a tent near the Bitterroot Mountains. But nothing stuck. It was as though he had dissolved into the landscape, faded into some empty cabin, or into the woods, or even, some believed, ended his own life in some remote place no one would ever find. But there was no body, and until there was, the case remained open. One of the detectives, a quiet man named Harris, kept a photo of Lauren in his desk drawer. He hadn't known her personally, but her story had embedded itself into his life. He often reread Paul's messages, trying to understand the tipping point, the place where love had curdled into obsession, where hurt had become hatred. One night, long after his shift had ended, Harris sat alone in the station and played one of Paul's recordings. "I just want her to see me. That's all I ever wanted. Someone to look at me like I mattered." Paul's voice cracked on that last word. Mattered. It was always about that, being seen, being valued. And when Lauren had stopped replying, Paul hadn't just felt rejected, he felt erased. It didn't justify what he did, it never would, but it explained how the storm inside him had started and why it had nowhere else to go. Back in Lauren's hometown, the candle by the window still burned some nights. A small flicker, a symbol, not of hope that Paul would be caught, but of something deeper. A hope that Lauren's story would be remembered, that the world wouldn't forget her, that love, real love, would outlast even the silence of a missing man. When tragedy strikes, what's left isn't just the loss, it's the pieces. The unread messages, the unopened drawers, the echoes of a life that was never meant to end that way. The evidence locker was full now, box after box labeled with names, dates, numbers, Paul's writings, Lauren's phone, photographs from the crime scene, audio files, witness statements. It was all there, an entire relationship reduced to evidence tags and transcripts. But there was one item that stood out, Lauren's journal. It wasn't part of the case at first. It had been found later, tucked between books in her bedroom, A pale blue cover, worn edges. The kind of thing no one would notice unless they were looking for it. Inside were pages of quiet pain. Lauren hadn't shared everything with her family. She didn't like worrying people, but she wrote about the long arguments, about the way Paul would pace the floor when he didn't get a response, about how she felt like a prisoner in her own home before she finally left. One entry read, "He looks at me like I betrayed him even when I haven't done anything wrong. I can't be everything he needs. I'm not enough for his pain. I never will be." Another, written the night she moved out, "I'm scared of what this might do to him, but I'm more scared of what staying would do to me." It was the final page that broke the detective's composure. "If anything happens to me, please know I love my kids more than anything. I just wanted peace. I just wanted to feel safe again." Lauren had felt it, the danger, the weight of it growing around her like smoke. She hadn't stopped living. She still worked, still smiled for her children, still made plans. But she had known, and even in the face of that fear, she chose to speak, if only on paper. That journal became the most powerful evidence they had, not for court, not for a jury, but for truth, for the reminder that Lauren wasn't just a victim. She was a woman who fought quietly to protect her children, a woman who saw the storm coming and tried to find shelter before it was too late, a woman who deserved to be remembered not for how her story ended, but for how deeply she tried to rewrite it. Closure doesn't always come with a knock on the door. Sometimes it comes like weather, quiet at first, then heavy enough to drown everything it touches. It was spring when the lead finally came. Months had passed since that January morning. Snow had melted into slush. The trees had begun to bloom again, and yet, for Lauren's family and for the detectives, the world had stood still. Then a phone rang. A park ranger in a remote stretch of Montana wilderness had stumbled across something strange. A small, weather-worn campsite. No firewood, no footprints. Just a sleeping bag, a half-empty water bottle, and a torn, faded notebook. It didn't look like much, but inside that notebook was a name. Joseph Paul DeWise. The handwriting was erratic, smudged by rain, but it was his, no doubt. Fragments of thoughts, sentences that trailed off, words written over and over again like a broken prayer. "She's gone. She's really gone. I didn't want this. I swear to God, I didn't want this. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I'm sorry." There was no signature, no date, no map, just a man's last confession buried under leaves and silence. The search team was deployed immediately. They combed the area for days, grid by grid, tracking dogs, helicopters, thermal cameras. Still no Paul, but something had changed. Now they had proof. He had been alive. He had been here, somewhere. The forest was endless, cold at night, thick with trees and shadows. If he was out there still, he wasn't living. He was hiding. From the law, from his past, from himself. Lauren's family was notified. Megan, her sister, stood at the window again as the news broke. The candle still sat on the sill, unlit now, but never moved. She listened quietly, then asked one question. "Did he say her name?" The detective paused. "No, just her. It was somehow worse, because even now, after everything, Paul couldn't speak her name. As if admitting it would make what he did more real. As if saying Lauren would mean facing the truth, finally, fully. But the truth didn't need his voice. It was already written in the silence he left behind. Justice doesn't always wear a badge or hold a gavel. Sometimes it shows up in whispers, soft but certain, carried not by the system, but by the survivors who keep telling the truth. No arrest had been made. No courtroom had been called to order. No handcuffs, no verdict, no trial. And yet, in the eyes of Lauren's family, justice had started to take shape, not through headlines or manhunts, but through remembrance. Because Lauren's story was no longer just a case file. It was being told, quietly, carefully, in classrooms, women's shelters, community circles. Her face, once blurred by tragedy, was now lit by meaning, a symbol, a caution, a voice for others. Megan spoke at her first event 6 months after the murder. She stood in a folding chair gymnasium in front of 20 strangers, survivors, counselors, and those trying to understand the signs they'd ignored. She held Lauren's photo in one hand and her journal in the other. She read, "I just wanted peace. I just wanted to feel safe again." The room fell still, because every woman there knew that line. They'd written it themselves in some form, thought it late at night, said it behind closed doors. Some had left, others were still trying. Megan continued speaking, soft, steady. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't dramatize what happened. She didn't need to. The truth already carried its own weight. Lauren's story lived in those spaces now, not as a headline, but as a warning. And her children, they were safe, loved, held gently by people who would never let them be defined by what happened to their mother. They spoke of her often, not about the violence, but about the way she danced in the kitchen, the way she used silly voices when reading bedtime stories, the way her hugs made you feel like everything in the world would be okay, even when it wasn't. That was Lauren, not what Paul had done, what she had lived, who she had been, and now, who she would always be. Some stories never truly end. They echo in the lives they touched, in the silence they left, in the truths they forced into the light. Paul was still missing. Years had passed now. His face, once posted on news reports and scattered across bulletin boards, had faded from the headlines, but not from memory, not from the places he'd broken. His name still existed in law enforcement databases. Occasionally, a tip would surface. A man matching his description spotted in a bus station in Oregon, a homeless camp in Idaho, a blurry photo someone swore looked like him. Each time the authorities followed up. Each time it led nowhere. There were those who believed he had died in the woods that spring, that he had succumbed to the elements, that his bones lay under pine needles and frost, never to be found. And maybe that was true. Or maybe he was still out there, ghost-like, fading deeper into the cracks of the world, unseen but not forgotten. But his physical presence no longer held power, because the damage he caused, the ripple he left, was already out there, living in others. Ashley, the woman who survived him, had moved away. A quiet life now, a different town, someplace smaller. She worked mornings at a bookstore and kept her phone on silent most of the time. She didn't speak publicly about what happened. She didn't need to. Her survival was its own kind of protest, its own kind of strength. Lauren's children continued to grow. They laughed again, played sports, learned how to tie their shoes and spell difficult words. Each year on Lauren's birthday, they lit a candle and said one thing they remembered about her. One child once said, "She made pancakes shaped like hearts, even on school days." It was such a small memory, but it mattered, because that's what remained, love. Not violence, not fear, love. It outlasted everything, even him. Some endings don't need justice to feel complete, they just need remembrance. A name spoken, a light kept on, a promise not to forget. Lauren's house has long since been sold. New paint covers the walls. The porch has been repaired. A different family lives there now. Laughter spills out on Saturday mornings. Bikes line the fence, and flowers bloom beneath the windows Lauren once looked out from. Life moved forward, but not away. In Megan's home, the candle still sits by the window. She doesn't light it every night anymore. Just when the grief returns, softly, like a familiar ache. On Lauren's birthday, on the day the world changed, or on those quiet evenings when the wind sounds like footsteps and the house feels too big. She doesn't cry as often, but when she does, it's softer, sharper. A kind of missing that doesn't ask for anything, just presence. Lauren's photo remains framed near the fireplace. Not because Megan needs reminding, but because it feels right. Because she mattered. Because she still does. The case of Joseph Paul DeWise remains officially open. His name sits in a database marked Wanted. His story in legal terms is unfinished, but for those who loved Lauren, closure was never going to come in the form of handcuffs. It came through her children's laughter, through Ashley's quiet resilience, through every woman who hears Lauren's story and chooses to leave, to speak, to survive. Lauren's life wasn't defined by how it ended. It was defined by how fiercely she loved, even while afraid. And now, when her children are asked about their mom, they don't speak of Paul. They speak of pancakes shaped like hearts, of bedtime songs sung off key, of hugs that could fix anything, even scraped knees or broken days. That's who Lauren was. And in that small kitchen window, on certain evenings, the candle still burns, soft, steady. A light for all the others still finding their way home. Still with me? If you're enjoying this and want more, go ahead and like the video and subscribe. I share a new story every night. Your support helps the channel grow and keeps the secrets coming. Now, let's get into story 2. In the summer of 2014, Katrina McGaw was enjoying a quiet evening at home in Ferguson, Missouri. She had just started settling into her new place, a modest ranch-style house she'd moved into only a few months earlier. That evening, Katrina sat down to watch a documentary about serial killers. It had been recommended by a family member, and like many people, Katrina was curious about true crime, about what makes a person cross the line into darkness. But she didn't expect the story to hit home, literally. As the documentary played, a chill ran down Katrina's spine. On the screen, they showed a crime scene, a small house in Ferguson, and she instantly recognized it. The layout, the brickwork, even the dining table and chairs. It was her house. Katrina realized she wasn't just watching any documentary. She was watching a story about the very place she now called home. And worse, it had once belonged to a man who had committed unthinkable acts within those same walls. The documentary called him the St. Louis Video Strangler. His real name was Maury Travis. Years earlier, Travis had brought women into that same house, tied them up, tortured them, and murdered them. The crimes had taken place right in the basement, a space Katrina had barely given a second thought to since moving in. But it was there, deep in the shadows of that home, that Maury Travis turned his darkest fantasies into reality. Crime scene photos in the documentary showed blood-stained floors and walls. Katrina stared in disbelief as she recognized pieces of furniture she used every day. She had eaten at that dining table, sat in those chairs. They had come with the house, a deal offered by the landlord. It turned out the furniture had once belonged to Maury Travis himself. Horrified, Katrina picked up the phone and called her landlord. She begged to be released from her lease, but the landlord refused. She showed no sympathy, none at all. Only later did Katrina find out the truth. Her landlord was Maury Travis's mother. Maury Travis's crimes were so brutal, so calculated, that even seasoned detectives had difficulty processing the details. He was believed to have murdered at least 17 women, possibly up to 20, in the early 2000s. Most were sex workers, women who had been pushed to the edges of society, living in a city marked by racial tension, poverty, and institutional neglect. He targeted them because they were vulnerable, because he knew no one would look for them right away, and because he thought no one would care. But someone did, and eventually that attention brought him down. Before the headlines, before the arrest, and before the discovery of videotapes showing him torturing his victims, Maury Travis was just another quiet man living in Ferguson. To neighbors, he seemed normal, polite even. He held jobs, maintained his house, and drove a sleek black Mitsubishi Eclipse that he kept spotless. On the surface, there was nothing alarming about him, but below the surface, in the basement of his home, he was building something else, a space for suffering, control, and death. Maury Travis was born on October 25th, 1965, in St. Louis, Missouri. Just 3 days before the completion of the Gateway Arch, the city's proudest monument. But while the arch soared high into the sky, young Maury's world remained confined and tense. He grew up in a city known for deep racial divides and economic inequality. St. Louis had a long and painful history of housing segregation. Real estate practices kept black families from moving out of impoverished neighborhoods. Public schools were underfunded, police departments overburdened. In this system, children like Maury Travis could slip through the cracks unnoticed. When he was 10, his family moved to Ferguson, a suburb just north of downtown St. Louis. On the outside, Maury was a quiet boy, too quiet. A former neighbor remembered him as respectful, someone who mowed lawns and kept to himself. Teachers at his high school, McClure High, said he barely spoke. One of them recalled being surprised when his arrest made the news. She only remembered him because of how unusually silent he was in class. Even in his high school yearbook, Travis was barely a presence. He was forgettable, a ghost. Psychologists today might describe someone like young Maury as displaying callous and unemotional traits, a lack of empathy, shallow emotions, and an ability to hide their real feelings. These traits, when they appear in childhood, can be early signs of psychopathy. But back then, in the 1970s, no one would have noticed, and if they had, there was no system in place to help him. Maury graduated high school late, at the age of 20, and joined the Army Reserves, working as a medical and dental assistant. For a time, he volunteered at a local nursing home. At 22, he enrolled at Morris Brown College in Atlanta, where he first learned to use computers. But it was also around this time that he fell into addiction, smoking crack cocaine, and spiraling into a life of petty crime. In the spring of 1988, Travis came back to Ferguson for a college break. Over 8 days, he robbed 5 shoe stores, using a plastic gun and stealing cash to support his addiction. He later claimed to have been spending $300 a day on crack. Police were able to track him down using his vehicle description. When they arrested him, they were surprised by his calm, polite behavior. "He wasn't your typical criminal," one detective said. In court, Maury admitted guilt and said he barely remembered the robberies. He wasn't violent, just high, strung out, desperate. Even his sentencing judge acknowledged the crime seemed out of character. Maury was sentenced to 15 years, but he would only serve a little over 5. He was sent to Farmington Correctional Center, about 70 miles south of St. Louis. Only 2 months in, he wrote a plea letter to the judge, a desperate, emotional document where he said the prison conditions were breaking him. He cried every night. He thought about suicide constantly. In the letter, he asked for a second chance. It's unclear whether his suffering was genuine or another example of manipulation, something psychopaths are known for. Either way, the system took pity. He was paroled in 1994 at the age of 28. What followed was a series of short-lived attempts to live a normal life. He worked as a waiter. He lived next to a reverend. He volunteered. He seemed to stay out of trouble, but the addiction didn't go away. Travis was back in prison by 1998 for drug possession, a parole violation. He was released in 1999, then arrested again in 2000, released in 2001. Each time the sentence was short. Each time he got out and returned to the same habits. And by the early 2000s, Maury Travis's crimes took a darker turn. No more petty thefts, no more short-term violations. He had something else in mind. By the time Maury Travis was released from prison in early 2001, he was 35 years old. He had spent nearly a fifth of his life behind bars, and most of the rest bouncing between addiction, unemployment, and parole violations. But this time, he did something different. He bought a house. It was a small ranch-style home on Ford Drive in Ferguson, Missouri. The same house Katrina McGaw would rent over a decade later. To neighbors, Travis seemed like any other resident trying to get by. He trimmed the hedges, mowed his lawn, and polished his beloved black Mitsubishi Eclipse every weekend. He kept the house clean, the car spotless, and the conversations brief. Inside, though, was another world. In that basement, Travis began to transform. The man who once cried himself to sleep in prison had become something far colder, something calculated. He didn't lash out in rage or lose control. Everything he did now had a structure, a rhythm. He built a space for torment, not impulsively, not in chaos, but with planning, intention, and purpose. Maury Travis found his victims mostly in St. Louis's Baden neighborhood, especially along Broadway, a stretch known for street-level sex work. The women he picked up were usually in crisis, addicted, displaced, struggling to survive. Many used crack cocaine, just as Travis did. That gave him an opening, a shared dependency, a false sense of comfort. He would offer money, drugs, or both. Some nights, Travis filmed what appeared to be consensual encounters. The women would smoke crack, engage in sex, and leave unharmed. But other nights, they never came out of that house. They disappeared. The shift from drug use to murder wasn't dramatic. It crept in. One woman didn't leave, then another. Soon, Travis was imprisoning women in his basement for days at a time, blindfolding them, binding their hands and legs, and taping their eyes shut. He kept them shackled to a support beam in the dark, and he filmed it all. Using a VHS camcorder, Travis documented what he did to these women. He turned his basement into a stage. He gave commands, forced them to dance, made them repeat phrases like, "You are the master. It pleases me to serve you," over and over. There were no masks, no aliases, just him in full control, recording everything. At first, the women didn't know what was happening. Many thought it was a role play, that it was part of the transaction. But as the hours turned into days, the fear took over. Travis didn't just hurt them physically. He taunted them, shamed them, and berated them for their addiction, all while forcing them deeper into the same trap he was caught in. To understand what Maury Travis was doing, it's important to see it clearly. This wasn't about impulse or anger. It was about power. The kind of control he felt he never had growing up, in school, in prison. Now he wielded it with absolute authority. And it wasn't just physical control. It was emotional dominance too. In one recording, he spoke softly to a woman as he tortured her. He asked if she was sorry. When she answered yes, he pressed further. "Sorry about what?" She told him, sorry to her children. Travis snapped. "You're not raising your kids," he said coldly. "You over here on your back smoking crack. You ain't going home tomorrow. I'm going to keep you about a week." He was angry, but not in the way most would expect. He was angry at himself, at his own addiction. By hurting these women, he was also punishing the part of himself he hated. And he was doing it in the most controlling way possible. The first known body was found on April 1st, 2001. It was Alyssa Greenwade, a 34-year-old mother of two who had struggled with crack cocaine addiction. She had recently started staying with a local reverend who tried to help her get clean. Just before her disappearance, she told the reverend she had met a new man and felt safe with him. 9 hours later, she was found partially clothed and strangled, dumped in a ditch in East St. Louis. No ID, no purse, no answers. Then came Teresa Wilson. Teresa was 36 and had grown up in the Baden neighborhood. As a teen, she wasn't involved with hard drugs. She became a mother at 17, raising a daughter with love and structure. But over time, crack took hold of her too. To support her addiction, she turned to sex work. Her life became unstable, and her daughter was eventually placed in a children's home. On May 15th, 2001, Teresa's body was found in West Alton, Missouri, 30 miles from where Alyssa had been discovered. Like Alyssa, she had been strangled and dumped. Her body was so decomposed that only a dental plate inscribed with the word "Wills" allowed for identification. 2 women, 2 dump sites, 2 crimes too similar to ignore. Police began to connect the dots. On May 23rd, 2001, a third body turned up. Betty James, 46, another sex worker. She had also been strangled. What disturbed investigators most was a tire mark across her leg, clear evidence that the killer had run her over. Then, on June 29th, another body, Veronica Thompson, 36, found near the same location as Teresa Wilson, just 16 feet away. That made 4 women in 2 months. Police could no longer dismiss the possibility of a serial killer. They formed a multi-jurisdictional task force, pulling in the FBI, the Illinois State Police, and homicide detectives from across the region. They analyzed each case, the way the women were found, the manner of death, their histories, and how close the dump sites were to one another. The killer wasn't sloppy, but he was making small mistakes, and soon he would make a big one. On July 4th, 2001, something unusual happened on Ford Drive. A woman was seen running naked from Maury Travis's home, screaming for help. Neighbors called the police. When officers arrived, they found Travis calm and composed. He claimed the woman had drugged him, tried to rob him, and fled. The woman said he had assaulted her, but no charges were filed. Neither party wanted to press the issue. It could have been the moment everything unraveled, but it wasn't, not yet. Travis returned to his quiet life. The car stayed polished, the house stayed clean, and the killings continued. On August 25th, 2001, the body of Yvonne Cruz was found. She too had been strangled and dumped. 2 weeks later, on October 8th, Brenda Beasley was discovered under similar conditions. But there was a key difference this time. On both women, police found semen, something they hadn't recovered before. And when they tested it, the DNA matched. They now had confirmation. The same man had killed both Yvonne and Brenda. It was the break they needed. But there was a problem. The DNA didn't match anyone in the National Criminal Database. Why? Because Travis's earlier crimes, the shoe store robberies, had happened before Missouri began collecting DNA from felons. He had slipped through a gap in the system, and for a while that gap protected him. By the fall of 2001, the streets of St. Louis had gone quieter, but not in the way anyone hoped. For months, the bodies of women had been turning up like clockwork, every 6 to 8 weeks. Each discovery carried the same horror: strangulation, partial nudity, signs of restraint, and dump sites carefully chosen in overgrown lots or abandoned spaces. By October, the city had recovered 6 victims. Then suddenly, it stopped. No new victims, no fresh clues. The task force combed through connections, evidence, and witness statements, but it all led to a dead end. And then came September 11th. The terror attacks on New York and Washington, D.C. captured the entire nation's attention. Newsrooms shifted focus. Law enforcement redirected resources. And in St. Louis, the fear of a serial killer slowly faded into the background, at least in the public's eyes. But Will Smith, a reporter at the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, couldn't shake the feeling that something had been missed. The victims, women like Alyssa Greenwade and Teresa Wilson, weren't just names on a list. They had families. They had lives. They deserved to be seen as more than just casualties of a secret predator, so he wrote. On May 19th, 2002, Smith's article appeared on the front page of the Post-Dispatch. It was a profile of Teresa Wilson, one of the early victims. But this was no cold recounting of her death. Smith wrote about Teresa's childhood, her struggles with addiction, her efforts to be a good mother, her attempts to climb back from the edge. He spoke to people who had known her, people who loved her, and people who remembered how hard she tried, even when it seemed like the world had forgotten her. It wasn't just about Wilson. It was a call for empathy, for the public to remember that these women weren't throwaways. They were human beings. The article had its intended effect. Readers paid attention. The conversation about the victims changed, but it also caught the eye of someone else. Someone who didn't like how the story was being told. Someone who wanted to remind the world who was really in control. 5 days later, on May 24th, 2002, the St. Louis Post-Dispatch received an envelope with no return name, just an address. one that, on first glance, appeared to be from New York. Inside was a printed letter and a map. The letter was short, typed in blocky font. It read, "Nice sob story about Teresa Wilson. Write a good one about Greenwade, and I'll tell you where many others are. To prove I'm real, here's directions to number 17. Search a 50-yard radius from the X." The map was a printed screenshot, a digital cutout of a vacant lot in West Alton, Missouri, not far from where earlier victims had been found. An X marked the spot. The envelope had no fingerprints, no DNA. The stamp was placed upside down, a traditional signal of distress, or perhaps an intentional flourish from someone who wanted to be noticed. The return address was fake, a bondage website URL with a made-up sender's name and a New York address. But the postmark was local. It didn't take long for law enforcement to understand what they were holding. It was a letter from the killer. On the morning of May 25th, 2002, a squad of detectives arrived at the vacant lot in West Alton. They had printed copies of the map. They knew what they were looking for. They didn't have to search long. Detective Marsha Corley was walking along the edge of an old railroad track when she saw what looked like a pale mushroom poking through the weeds. As she got closer, her breath caught. It wasn't a mushroom. It was a human skull. Nearby, more skeletal remains were scattered through the grass. A torso, still partially clothed in a woman's dress, lay a few yards away. The bones were bleached from months in the sun. The decomposition was advanced. But there was no doubt. The map was real, and the person who sent it knew the victim was there, because he put her there. Until that moment, authorities had recovered 10 bodies, only 7 of which could be identified. But in the letter, the writer claimed this was number 17. It was a disturbing revelation. Either the killer was inflating his count to confuse investigators, or there were at least 7 more victims no one had found yet. For detectives, both possibilities were horrifying. But one thing was certain. The killer had just made a mistake. He had reached out, left a digital trace, mailed physical evidence, put himself back on the board. He wasn't as invisible as he thought. The key to finding him lay in the map. It had been printed from the travel site Expedia.com, which was owned at the time by Microsoft. Investigators served a grand jury subpoena requesting records of all users who had searched for West Alton, Missouri in the days before the letter was mailed. It was a long shot, but it worked. The team narrowed the search to one IP address. Just one person had zoomed in on that exact area, on those exact coordinates, between May 18th and May 21st, the dates when the killer likely prepared the letter. That IP address was assigned by WorldCom, a major internet provider at the time. Another subpoena, another trace. And then they had a name, Maury Travis. By June 4th, 2002, the FBI and local police had Maury Travis under 24-hour surveillance. They knew where he lived. They knew about his past convictions. And they knew his address was just a short drive from several dump sites. What they didn't yet have was a warrant to search the house. But it was coming. 3 days later, on the morning of June 7th, agents knocked on the door of 1001 Ford Drive. Maury Travis answered in his underwear. He didn't seem surprised. He didn't ask why they were there. He let them in. Still half asleep and in his underwear, he didn't seem startled. He didn't ask what was going on. He just looked at them. Calm, quiet, waiting. When they showed him the search warrant, he nodded. No protest, no argument. He got dressed, then joined them in the living room. From the start, Travis tried to maintain control. He chose where to sit. He asked questions casually. When the officers tried small talk, "Where'd you grow up?" or "What kind of work have you done?" he answered with deflections. One-word replies, repeat questions, shrugs. But what stood out most wasn't what he said. It was what he did. Each time one of the detectives leaned down to pet his calico cat, Travis stiffened. After the second time, he picked the cat up and moved it out of their reach, placing it beside him protectively. To the agents, it was a small but telling moment. The cat was his property, his control. In that moment, it was the one thing in the room he still had power over, and he didn't like anyone else touching it. The upstairs of Travis's house was as expected, neat, organized, spotless. Carpets vacuumed, counters wiped down, dishes clean. But when the FBI evidence recovery team stepped into the basement, everything changed. The air was heavy, the light dim, and the basement, unlike the rest of the home, was in disarray. A mattress on the floor, ropes, belts, stains, scrapes on the walls, hooks in the ceiling, blood, some of it faint, some of it visible, all of it real. It didn't take long for the agents to realize they were standing in the exact place so many women had described, before they disappeared forever. This was the prison. This was where it all happened. Then, behind a false wall, they found the final piece. A VHS tape labeled wedding tape. The first hour and 26 minutes showed a real wedding, family, music, joy. But after that, something else entirely. The detectives sat together to review the footage. They knew it would be bad, but they weren't prepared for what they saw. The camera showed Maury Travis. There was no mask, no disguise. It was him. Calm, composed, methodical. The footage began with one woman. She was naked, blindfolded, her hands tied. Travis taunted her, demanded she say things like, "You are the master." He made her repeat it, again and again. Then he placed a belt around her neck. He strangled her, slowly, until she stopped moving. He did not turn the camera away. The tape continued. Other women appeared, some older, some younger. One by one, Travis did the same thing. Stun gun, verbal abuse, sexual assault, strangulation. There were moments where he spoke softly, others where he exploded with rage, and through it all, he filmed. When the tape ended, there was no doubt. Maury Travis had documented his crimes in full detail. He had created his own private film, not as a trophy, but as a way to relive the power, replay the control, and feed the same need over and over. The detectives, some with decades of experience, were shaken. Counseling was offered to everyone who viewed it. Back in the living room, Travis sat between FBI Special Agent Robert Morton and Detective Tim Sachs. They didn't arrest him immediately. They didn't accuse. Instead, they kept the tone casual, conversational, friendly. They showed him photos of the victims, smiling pictures taken before their deaths. Travis looked at them and said he didn't know any of them. 10 minutes later, he asked to see the pictures again. "You know these girls were murdered," Sachs told him, though they hadn't said that before. It was a trick, an interrogation tactic, and it worked. Travis dropped his head. "You got me," he said quietly. Then he looked up. "Come on," he said. "I'll take you." "You'll take us where?" the agents asked. "You know where," Travis replied. "It's what you've been asking for this whole time. I'll give you what you want." The three men got into a squad car. Travis sat in the back. He told them to drive east, across the Mississippi River toward East St. Louis. For a few minutes, they believed he was actually going to show them where other victims were buried. But as they neared the bridge, something in him shifted. He stared out the window. His posture changed. Then he spoke. "I changed my mind," he said. "Take me to jail." He repeated it, louder this time. "Take me to jail. Lock me out." He wouldn't say why. He wouldn't say more. The agents turned the car around and drove him back to St. Louis Police Headquarters. Over the next several hours, Maury Travis was questioned repeatedly. He didn't confess, but he didn't deny either. He seemed more interested in how he had been caught. They told him about the map. He cursed the internet, muttering that he should have known better. He asked several times what he would tell his mother. He didn't talk about his victims. He didn't apologize. But his one concern, the only sliver of emotion he showed, was how his mother would see him. The mask had started to crack, but he wasn't done playing the game. While Travis sat in custody, the FBI continued processing the house. They found Blood on the walls and floors, ropes, belts, and shackles. Women's underwear and wigs, a stun gun, a hand-drawn diagram for building a concrete holding cell in the basement. Notes describing how to pick up, restrain, and dispose of victims. Marked maps of local areas, places to find sex workers, and places to dump bodies. They also examined the tires on Travis's Mitsubishi Eclipse. They matched the tread marks found on Betty James's leg. The noose was tightening. Maury Travis was placed in a one-man cell on the 8th floor of the St. Louis County Justice Center. It was a maximum security unit. He was being held on 2 federal kidnapping charges, tied to the deaths of Alyssa Greenwade and Betty James. But everyone knew more charges were coming. Evidence was still being processed. DNA testing was underway, and prosecutors were preparing for what would likely be a capital murder trial. He wouldn't be getting out, not this time. Travis had been in prison before, but this time was different. This time he wasn't a man trying to get clean. He wasn't just another drug offender hoping for leniency. This time, he was a man the world now knew as a serial killer, and it was a title he wasn't willing to carry. On July 10th, 2002, just 3 days after his arrest, Maury Travis was found hanging in his cell. He had used a bedsheet twisted tightly and fed through a vent above the toilet. He had bound his own hands behind his back. He'd stuffed toilet paper into his nostrils and gagged himself with a washcloth. Over his head, he'd pulled a pillowcase. It was as methodical as everything else he'd done. Even in death, Travis showed the same level of control and planning that defined his crimes. He took no chances that he might survive the attempt. He eliminated the body's natural reflexes, gagging, gasping, by disabling his own mouth and nose. He didn't want there to be any mistakes, and there weren't. Travis was supposed to be on suicide watch. Mental health staff had evaluated him just 2 days earlier. A guard was instructed to check his cell every 15 minutes, and a fellow inmate, part of a peer observation program, was posted outside his cell as an added precaution. It should have been enough, but that night, 2 scheduled checks never happened. At 7:30 p.m. and 7:45 p.m. At 7 p.m., Travis's cell door automatically unlocked for an hour of day room time. He stepped out briefly into the vestibule outside his cell, the one area where the inmate observer couldn't see fully into the back corner. He took a shower. Then, at 7:15 p.m., he stepped back inside. He had 45 minutes of unsupervised access. That's all it took. At 8 p.m., when the door locked again, the observer looked through the window and saw his body hanging. It was the first suicide at the facility since it had opened. Authorities found a suicide note addressed to his mother. In it, Travis apologized for being sick in the head. He told her she had been a good mother, that he had never felt normal, never felt happy. He wrote, "I think about the life I led and the months ahead of me. This seems to be the best solution for all involved, especially me, because I won't spend the rest of my life locked up, or worse, let them kill me with a needle." He ended the note with a final message to his mother. "Tell everyone I love them. I love you most, but you know that." Travis's death stunned the investigators. They weren't just hoping for a conviction, they were hoping for answers. Travis had claimed in his letter to the Post-Dispatch that he had 17 victims, but police had only identified 10 bodies, and only 7 of those were fully confirmed. What about the rest? Where were they? And who were they? Now they would never know. By dying before trial, Travis robbed the victims' families of justice. He took away the opportunity for them to ask why, and hear the answer from the man who had taken so much. He kept the final secrets to himself. To law enforcement and psychologists, Travis's suicide wasn't just about shame. It wasn't simply fear of a needle or life in prison. It was about power. In life, Travis had always sought control over his home, over his routines, over the women he brought into his basement. Every act of torture, every videotape, every forced ritual, it was all about dominance. Now facing a system that had finally cornered him, He made sure the last move was still his. He decided when the story ended. Not everyone believed it. Some of Travis's relatives, especially his cousins, said the suicide didn't make sense to them. They couldn't understand how he'd done it under suicide watch. They pointed out that if he wanted to die, he could have done it before he was ever arrested. One cousin, Stephanie Talley, said, "It just doesn't add up. I don't believe his death was a suicide. I don't. Not in my heart." But investigators stood firm. The autopsy showed no signs of struggle, no bruising, no trauma beyond the marks from the noose. His wrists were bound, yes, but in a way that someone could do to themselves, slowly and deliberately. It was suicide, plain and cold, and Travis had made sure it worked. For the families of his victims, the suicide brought a complicated mix of emotions. Some were angry, others felt robbed, a few felt numb. Melinda Greenwade, sister of victim Alyssa Greenwade, said, "I wanted to talk to him. I wanted to ask him why. But she never got the chance, and likely never will." Maury Travis died alone in a locked cell, in the silence he had always preferred. But the noise he left behind never really stopped. The house at 1001 Ford Drive was quiet again. The crime scene tape came down. The basement was cleaned. Years passed. Neighborhoods changed. And the story began to fade from public memory. Just another dark chapter in the long history of St. Louis. But not for the families, not for the detectives, not for the city that unknowingly housed a man who filmed his murders while neighbors waved from across the lawn, and not for Katrina McGaugh. It was the summer of 2014, 12 years after Travis's arrest and death, when Katrina settled into her new rental home in Ferguson, Missouri. It was a good deal, a furnished house with everything she needed, a quiet neighborhood, simple, comfortable. She didn't know what had happened there. No one told her. One night, she was watching a documentary about serial killers, something true crime related, one of those shows recommended by a family member. The usual intrigue, morbid curiosity. Then she saw it, the house on the screen, her house. She froze. The floors, the layout, the furniture, even the dining table she ate at every night. It was all there. A crime scene, a place of suffering, the home of a man who had imprisoned, tortured, and murdered women in the very basement she'd walked past without a second thought. Panicked, she called the landlord, begging to be released from her lease. The landlord refused. Only later did Katrina discover the reason why. The woman she had been paying rent to, the woman who had offered her a furnished deal, was Sandra Travis, Maury Travis's mother. Missouri law does not require landlords to disclose if a violent crime, suicide, or murder has taken place on the property. Legally, no one had to tell Katrina, but ethically, it left scars. The St. Louis Housing Authority eventually stepped in and helped dissolve the lease. Katrina moved out, but the story made headlines again. Suddenly, the house was back in the public eye. The basement returned to the city's imagination, and people asked the same question all over again. How many women had died there? The truth, no one knows. When Maury Travis sent that typed letter to the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, he claimed 17 victims. Police recovered 10 bodies. 7 remain unaccounted for, at least by his count. And there's always the chilling possibility that the number was even higher. But the tragedy isn't just the number. It's how many of those women were never identified. They were found in ditches, empty lots, alleys overrun with weeds. No ID, no purse. No one searching for them. Their families either never knew they were gone or never knew where to look. And some women may never have been found at all. Their final resting places could be anywhere in the miles of empty space surrounding St. Louis, left to weather and time. Even in death, they remained invisible. Maury Travis was able to operate as long as he did not because he was brilliant, but because the women he chose were ignored by society. Most of them were sex workers. Most had drug addictions. Most came from underfunded neighborhoods with little access to protection or support. That made them perfect targets. When a sex worker goes missing, the response is rarely swift. Many police departments are overworked, and the legal system treats sex work as a crime, not a public health issue. As a result, those who are most at risk often receive the least protection. And that's exactly what Travis counted on. But one person refused to look away. Will Smith, a journalist at the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, couldn't stop thinking about the victims. He had no idea that his article about Teresa Wilson, written to humanize her, would flush out the killer himself, but it did. Smith's writing forced the city to look beyond mugshots and rap sheets. He reminded readers that these women were people, daughters, mothers, sisters, friends. They laughed, they loved, they fought to survive. He told the stories no one else wanted to tell. And in doing so, he stirred something in Maury Travis, a desire to reassert control, to correct the narrative, to send that infamous letter. That letter and the map inside led investigators to Travis's computer. That map ended his spree. One of the most sobering realizations in this story is how close Travis came to getting away. When he printed that map from Expedia.com, internet crime investigations were still new. The idea of tracing an IP address to an individual user was cutting edge at the time. Exactly 4 months after Travis printed his map, the Tor project, a free tool to anonymize internet activity, was released to the public. Had Travis waited just a few more months or used better digital hygiene, he might have stayed hidden. He might have killed again. The tools that caught him came just in time. It's easy to call someone like Maury Travis a monster. It makes the story simpler, cleaner, easier to digest. But monsters aren't real. People are. Maury Travis was born. He had a mother who loved him. He went to school. He wore uniforms. He walked down the street like anyone else. He paid bills, cleaned his car, helped neighbors carry groceries. And behind all of that, he planned the deaths of women whose lives he didn't think mattered. He was not a monster. He was a man who made calculated choices and believed no one would stop him. The house on Ford Drive still stands. The basement is still there, but the bodies are gone. The crime scene tape is long removed. The VHS tapes are locked away in evidence storage. The voices of the women he hurt have fallen silent. All that's left are the ripples. The mothers who never got answers. The sisters who never got justice. The children who never saw their mothers again. The names that were never even written down. And a reporter who tried to make sure someone remembered. Maury Travis once said, during interrogation, that he'd felt this way his whole life, that something was wrong with him from the beginning. He never smiled, never felt happy. He said it calmly, like it was just another fact. Maybe that's true. But whatever he lacked in feeling, he made up for in harm. He left behind a trail of bodies, broken families, and a basement that still echoes in nightmares. And still, we don't know the whole story, but we know enough. Enough to remember the women. Enough to keep asking the hard questions. Enough to never call them invisible again. Maury Travis is gone. But the women he targeted, the ones he thought no one would miss, deserve to be remembered. Their stories matter. If this case affected you, or made you think about how society treats its most vulnerable, let me know in the comments. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video. Not for the views, but because the more we remember these names, the less likely they are to be erased. Another case drops tomorrow. Until then, thanks for watching, stay safe, and take care of each other.